He spent years keeping a skyscraper from falling, and nobody even knew his name. A CEO laughed him out of the room. A CFO buried the evidence. And an entire building full of engineers missed what one maintenance worker had been tracking in a worn notebook for 3 years straight. But the day the walls finally started talking, the only person who understood what they were saying was the man everyone had already written off. If this is your kind of story, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The elevator doors slid open on the 42nd floor, and Elias Mercer stepped out carrying a mop bucket, a clipboard, and a cup of gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the 18th floor. He didn't look like much. That was the truth of it, and he'd long since stopped fighting it. The gray maintenance uniform had his name stitched above the left breast pocket in block letters, but in 3 years of working at Ashford and Vance Structural Consulting, he could count on one hand the number of people above the custodial staff who had ever actually read it. The 42nd floor was the executive tier, glass offices, marble accents, the kind of carpeting that swallowed sound whole, so that everyone up here existed in a perpetual hush, like the world outside didn't quite apply. Elias had cleaned these hallways 100 times. He knew which light fixtures buzzed, which corner office had a slow drain, and exactly which stretch of the northeast corridor produced a faint, almost imperceptible vibration when the wind hit the building above the 39th floor at a particular angle. He also knew that in the past 11 days, that vibration had changed. It was subtle. Subtle enough that you'd never notice it unless you were paying attention, and nobody up here was paying that kind of attention. These were people who paid other people to notice things. But Elias had been noticing, and what he'd noticed had been keeping him up at night. He set the bucket down near the service corridor entrance and pulled the clipboard from under his arm. The top sheet was covered in handwritten numbers, timestamps, displacement readings, notes in his cramped, precise handwriting. He'd been pulling data off the building's structural monitoring terminals for over a week, cross-referencing it with the weather logs and the construction activity happening on the adjacent lot. What he was seeing didn't add up in a good way. The door to the main conference room burst open at the end of the hall. "I don't care what the vendor says, Marcus. If their sensors can't give us clean data in a wind event, they're useless to us." The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford and Vance, and it filled the corridor the way her voice always did, like it owned the space it occupied. She was mid-40s, sharp-featured, dressed in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Elias made in a month. She walked fast, the way powerful people do when they've decided a conversation is over. Behind her, Marcus Holt, the firm's head of internal engineering, struggled to keep pace. "The readings could still be instrument error," he was saying. "We've got the external review team coming in Thursday. Thursday is too late. I need answers before the Hargrove group meeting on Wednesday." Victoria glanced at her phone, then looked up and stopped. Elias was standing in the middle of the corridor. She looked at him the way people look at a vending machine that's in the wrong place. Not hostile, exactly, just confused by the inconvenience. "Maintenance?" she said, not quite to him, not quite to anyone. "Yes, ma'am." He kept his voice level. "Elias Mercer. I've been assigned to the 42nd and 43rd floors this week." "Right." She was already looking past him. "You're going to want to hold off on whatever you're doing up here until after 4. We have back-to-back meetings all afternoon." "I understand. I can work around the schedule." He hesitated for just a moment because he'd been rehearsing this in his head since 6 o'clock that morning, and he still wasn't sure how it was going to land. "But before I do, I wanted to flag something about the building." Victoria's eyes came back to him slowly. "The northeast load-bearing section," he said, "between floors 38 and 41. I've been tracking the sensor readouts for the past week and a half, and there's a pattern that I think warrants a closer look." A beat of silence. Marcus Holt blinked. "The sensor readouts," Victoria repeated. "Yes, the displacement increments have been creeping outside normal variance since last Tuesday, slowly but consistently. It correlates with the deep excavation work on the Delman site next door, specifically the directional drilling they've been running on the northeast quadrant of that lot." He tapped the clipboard. "I've been logging it." Victoria looked at the clipboard. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Mercer." She said it carefully, the way you'd speak to someone who just told you they'd solved a problem that a team of engineers hadn't been able to crack. I appreciate your diligence, but our engineering team monitors this building's structural systems. That's what they're paid to do. I know. I'm not trying to overstep. Our systems are showing sensor anomalies, Marcus cut in, with the defensive energy of a man whose territory had just been questioned. That's a calibration issue. Our external review is already scheduled. The sensors aren't the problem, Elias said. He kept his voice quiet and even, the way you do when you're trying not to spook someone. The sensors are working fine. What they're reading is the problem. Another silence. This one had a different texture. Victoria Ashford looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, and he already knew which way it was going to land before she opened her mouth. "I'll have someone from the engineering team take a look at your concerns," she said. The tone was final, professional. The tone of someone who had learned exactly how to close a door without slamming it. "You can leave your notes at the front desk." She walked past him. Marcus followed without making eye contact. Elias stood in the corridor for a moment, holding his clipboard, listening to the sound of their footsteps fade into the carpet. Then he turned, picked up his mop bucket, and went back to work. He'd grown up around buildings. His father had been a civil engineer, the kind who still showed up to job sites in steel-toed boots, even after he'd made enough money that he didn't have to. By the time Elias was 12, he could read a load diagram. By the time he was 16, he was spending his summers doing field surveys. It wasn't something he'd chosen so much as something that had chosen him, the way some people are just wired to see the world in terms of forces and resistance, stress, and support. He'd gone to Carver Technical Institute on a partial academic scholarship and a lot of student loans he'd spent the next decade paying off. Graduated top of his class. Spent 3 years at a mid-sized firm in Cleveland learning the fundamentals, then another 2 at a large infrastructure consultancy in Pittsburgh that handled bridge assessments for 3 different state DOTs. He was good at it, not in a flashy way. He'd never been flashy, but in the way that made senior partners put his name on reports and project managers specifically request him for the complicated ones. At 31, he'd taken a position at Ashford and Vance. He'd been there 2 years when he met Claire. She hadn't been in the industry. She'd been a high school history teacher who spent her summers doing archival research and her weekends at flea markets looking for anything made before 1960. She had a loud laugh that she apologized for and then did again immediately. She thought structural engineering was fascinating in the same way a root canal is fascinating, and told him so on their second date, and he'd laughed harder than he had in years. They got married on a Tuesday at the county courthouse, because Claire said weekends were for people who wanted to perform their happiness for an audience. They bought a small house in a neighborhood that was, Claire said, up and coming in the way that means the coffee shops are expensive and everything else is still broken. Then Mila was born. Then, when Mila was 14 months old, Claire went in for what the doctors had told them was a routine procedure to address a congenital heart defect they'd known about since college. She never woke up from it. Elias took 3 weeks of bereavement leave. Then he went back to work. He lasted 4 months. It wasn't that he couldn't function. He could function. He went through the motions with a competence that probably fooled a lot of people, but somewhere in those 4 months he'd come to understand, with a clarity that settled into him like concrete setting, that Mila needed more than a father who showed up at 6:30 in the evening after a 10-hour day and spent the weekends catching up on project files. She was 14 months old and learning to walk, and she needed someone who was actually present. And the only way he could figure out how to do that, how to actually be there, not just physically but in the way that mattered, was to stop doing the thing that was consuming him. So he'd left. He'd filed the paperwork, returned his badge, packed the framed photos and the coffee mug and the small model of the Milo Viaduct he kept on his desk, and walked out of Ashford and Vance with a handshake from his project manager and a look from the senior partner that said they both knew he wasn't coming back. He'd spent 6 months just being Mila's dad. Savings dwindled. He picked up part-time work doing freelance assessments, small jobs, nothing that required him to be anywhere specific for more than a few hours. When Mila started preschool, he looked at the math and the math was honest with him, and he started looking for steady work. Maintenance had made sense in a particular kind of way. The hours were predictable. The physical proximity to buildings had been a comfort in the months when nothing else was. And there was something almost meditative about the work. The repetition of it, the clarity of each task, the fact that at the end of a shift, something was visibly cleaner or fixed or in better shape than it had been 8 hours before. He'd applied to 5 companies. Ashford and Vance had called back first. He was fairly certain no one there recognized his name. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Elias had made it down to the 39th floor, where the maintenance access corridor ran along the northeast side of the building. This was the part of his route he paid the most attention to these days. He set down the supply cart and pressed one hand flat against the interior wall. This was something he'd been doing for 11 days, not because it looked like anything, but because certain kinds of information you couldn't get from a readout screen. You had to feel it. The vibration was there, low, almost imperceptible. But it had been 3 days since it last died down overnight, which meant it was no longer fluctuating with activity on the Delman site. It was now continuous. That was new. He pulled out his notebook, a standard composition book, the kind Mila used for school, because he'd run out of the engineer's field books he used to favor and hadn't gotten around to ordering more. He noted the time, the location, his subjective assessment of the vibration. Then he opened the maintenance access panel on the northeast interior wall and crouched down to check the conduit anchors, which he'd started inspecting on this stretch every 2 days. The third anchor from the left had moved. Not much. A fraction of a centimeter, maybe. But the small chalk mark he'd made on the wall last Thursday was no longer lined up with the anchor bracket. He'd been dismissed as someone who didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew exactly what he was looking at. And what he was looking at was a building that was talking to anyone willing to hear it. He photographed the anchor with his phone, added the image to the folder he'd been building, wrote the date and measurements in the notebook. Then he closed the panel, picked up his cart, and moved on to the next section. Mila was 7 years old and deeply opinionated about breakfast foods. Eggs can't touch the toast, she informed him gravely, standing at the kitchen counter in her pajamas while he scrambled eggs on the stovetop. They've been touching since the beginning of time, Mila. That doesn't make it okay. She was small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of tilting her head to the left when she was thinking through a problem that she'd had since she was old enough to think through problems. She approached the world with a seriousness that people sometimes found funny in a 7-year-old, but Elias didn't find funny. He found it one of the most recognizable things about her, because he'd been exactly the same. "How was school?" he asked. "Mostly fine. Tommy Reese said that the tallest buildings in the world would fall down if an earthquake was big enough. And I said that wasn't true because engineers designed them to resist earthquakes. And he said I was wrong. And I said he was wrong. Who was right?" She gave him a look. "Me. Obviously." He smiled. "You were right. They're designed to absorb seismic energy, not resist it directly. It's the difference between a tree that bends and a tree that breaks." She considered this. Tommy Reese would be the tree that breaks. Elias laughed, actually laughed, the kind that surprised him. He slid the eggs onto her plate, careful, though he considered it absurd, to make sure they didn't touch the toast. She ate with one hand and used the other to flip through a library book about bridges. He watched her for a moment, the way he still sometimes did, with that specific kind of gratitude that had no name, the feeling of understanding exactly where the important things were. "Po Marty." The next morning, Elias arrived at work to find an email waiting in the maintenance staff's shared inbox. It was addressed to the department head, copied to facilities management, and referenced recent staff inquiries regarding structural systems. The message, from Marcus Holt's assistant, stated in the careful language of corporate dismissal that all structural concerns should be directed to the engineering department through proper channels, and that maintenance staff were not to access structural monitoring data terminals without prior authorization. He read it twice. He'd never accessed a terminal without authorization. The monitoring data he'd been reviewing was visible on the public-facing display panels that the engineering team had installed in the common maintenance corridors for exactly the purpose of allowing building staff to flag anomalies. He'd been doing what the system was designed for him to do, but that wasn't really the point of the email, and he knew it. He printed the email, folded it, and added it to the folder. On the third day after the corridor conversation, he stopped by the engineering bullpen on the 26th floor. Not the executive tier, just the working floor where the younger engineers sat at clustered workstations surrounded by red-marked drawings and second monitors displaying live structural feed data. He knew one of them. Sort of. Her name was Priya Anand, and she'd started at Ashford and Vance about 18 months after he'd left the firm the first time around. She didn't know his background. Nobody here did, as far as he could tell. But she'd been friendly to him in the unremarkable way of someone who treated everyone with basic decency. She'd once asked him about a weird sound coming from the HVAC unit near her desk, and he'd fixed it, and she'd thanked him like he'd done something meaningful. He found her at her desk, staring at a set of waveform plots on her screen with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been looking at the same data for too many hours. "Hey," he said. She looked up. "Hey, Elias." She actually used his name. He'd noted that. He nodded at the screen. "Northeast sector?" She blinked. "How did you—" "Yeah. We've been trying to figure out what's generating this noise in the feed. The instruments are showing variance patterns that don't match any of our load models." "Can I look?" A small hesitation. Not suspicious, more surprised. Then she turned the monitor slightly toward him. He studied the waveform. The pattern was exactly what he expected. He pointed to a cluster of peaks. "These spikes, are they correlating with anything on a time interval?" She pulled up another window. "Roughly every 90 minutes, but it doesn't line up with any scheduled building activity." "What about the Delman excavation schedule? Their directional drill cycles?" Priya stared at the screen, then she looked at him. "How do you know about the drill cycles?" "I've been watching the pattern." He hesitated, then said it plainly. "Look, I know this might sound strange, but I've been documenting the sensor data on the northeast section for about 11 days. The vibration pattern correlates with the drilling operations on the adjacent lot, but in the last 3 days it's shifted. It's no longer tied to the drill activity. It's become continuous. I think there may be something happening to the Northeast Foundation interface that's being picked up as sensor noise because nobody's looking for it in the right place." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Where are you getting your data?" she asked. "Corridor monitoring panels, my own field observations, a few measurements I've taken on the maintenance corridors on 38 through 40. She looked at him for a long moment. He'd heard that look described once, by a mentor, as the moment when someone decides whether they're dealing with a nuisance or a person worth taking seriously. He watched her make that decision. "You should write this up formally," she said. "An official concern report. Route it through facilities to an engineering review." "I tried." He didn't say more than that. A beat of silence. She looked at her screen, then back at him. "I'll look at the drill cycle data," she said quietly. "I can't promise anything." "I know." He straightened. "Thank you, Priya." He left the building that afternoon the same way he always did. Service elevator to the basement garage, a 3-block walk to the transit stop, 40 minutes on the train to the neighborhood where he and Mila rented the 3rd floor of a narrow row house from a retired couple who lived downstairs and slipped homemade soup under the door in winter. The train was loud and smelled like floor cleaner and wet coats, and Elias sat with his notebook on his knee and worked through the calculations he'd been doing in his head for the past 3 days. The numbers weren't improving. The problem, if he was right about what was happening, wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. Not immediately. The timeline he was looking at, based on the rate of change he'd observed, was measured in weeks rather than days. But structural problems had a habit of accelerating once they crossed certain thresholds. And what troubled him was that he couldn't rule out the possibility that they were already closer to a threshold than his data showed. He'd filed 3 written concern reports in the past 2 weeks. One to the facilities department, one to the engineering review inbox, and one, he'd felt slightly foolish doing it, but he'd done it, addressed directly to the office of Victoria Ashford, with a cover note that kept the language professional and specific. He'd heard back about exactly one of them, the email instructing maintenance staff to stop accessing monitoring data. He wasn't angry, exactly. He'd spent enough time in the professional world to understand the machinery of how concerns got managed, how they got logged and categorized and quietly deprioritized, how the person raising them got labeled a problem before the problem itself ever got evaluated. He'd seen it happen to other people, He hadn't expected to be on the other side of it, but here he was. He stared out the train window at the city sliding past in the gray afternoon light and thought about what his options actually were. He could escalate more formally, to the building management company, to the city's building safety office, to the state licensing board. Any of those would take time he wasn't sure he had, and all of them would create a paper trail that would, in the most likely outcome, result in his termination before anyone took the underlying concern seriously. He could go outside the firm entirely, talk to someone in the engineering community who could evaluate what he was seeing, but that meant disclosure, which meant explaining who he was and how he'd come by the information, which opened a different set of complications. Or he could keep doing what he was doing, keep documenting, keep watching. Hope that Priya or someone like her started asking the right questions from inside the engineering team, where the answers had institutional weight in a way that they didn't coming from him. He got off the train and walked the 4 blocks to the row house, hands in his jacket pockets. The afternoon had turned cold, and the sky was the color of old concrete. He could hear Mila before he reached the front door. A one-sided argument with someone on the phone, which turned out, when he got inside, to be her grandfather, Elias's father, who lived in Tucson now and called every Tuesday and Thursday with a reliability that had become one of the small constants of their life. Papa says Grandpa is wrong about the Hoover Dam, Mila told him, holding the phone out. He took it. Dad, she's exactly like you, his father said, by way of greeting. Stubborn and technically correct about everything. What did you say about the Hoover Dam? I just said it was impressive. He said it was the biggest dam in the world, Mila said, loudly enough to be heard by the phone. It's not. It's not even close. She's not wrong, Elias said. A sigh. I was speaking colloquially. Grandpa, Mila said, taking the phone back with the energy of someone completing a task. Colloquially is not an excuse for saying untrue things. Elias started on dinner, half listening to the conversation, feeling the day settle around him in the specific way it did when he walked through this door. The particular decompression of being back in a place where the stakes were clear and the things that mattered were right in front of him. He thought about the chalk mark on the wall, the anchor that had moved. He started a pot of water for pasta. 2 days later, Priya appeared in the northeast maintenance corridor on the 39th floor with a tablet and a look on her face that Elias recognized as someone who'd found something they'd been hoping they wouldn't find. The drill cycles, she said, without preamble. You pulled them. The Delman site runs directional bore cycles on an 87-minute interval. I mapped them against our sensor anomaly timestamps. She turned the tablet so he could see the overlay. It's not the drill cycles causing the variance. He nodded. The variance is pre-existing. The drill cycles are just the reason it surfaced. There's lateral stress accumulation in the Northeast Foundation interface. Her voice was careful, technical, the voice of someone keeping emotion out of their words through deliberate effort. The accumulation pattern is consistent with progressive microfracturing in the bearing strata. It's slow, but it's not stopping. How long have the readings been outside normal parameters? She looked at him. Based on the archived sensor data, and there is archived data, it's just nobody flagged it. The pattern begins 14 months ago. Silence. 14 months. He'd been here 3 years and had started noticing this 11 days ago. 14 months of readings sitting in a database that someone should have been reviewing. I'm going to take this to Marcus, she said. He already knows. He said it flat, not dramatically. Not this specifically, maybe, but he knows there are anomalies. He told Victoria Ashford it was instrument calibration. Priya's face did something complicated. Elias, if what I'm looking at is accurate, I know. I have to take this up the chain. Yes, he met her eyes. You should. And when you do, take it all the way up. Don't let it get stopped at Marcus's desk. She held the tablet against her chest, a human habit, the way people hold things when they're steadying themselves. How do you know all of this? The way you looked at that waveform the other day? He didn't answer right away. The corridor was quiet except for the low hum of the HVAC system, and, if you were paying attention, a sound underneath it that most people would have called nothing. I just pay attention, he said finally. She looked at him for a moment longer than felt entirely casual. Then she nodded. "I'll take it to Diane Chen," she said. That was the firm's director of structural integrity, senior partner level, someone whose name was on the building inspection certifications, someone above Marcus. "Today." "Good." She started back down the corridor, then paused. "Elias, are you—" She stopped, started again. "How many other floors have you documented?" 37 through 43, he said. She absorbed this. That's a comprehensive set. 11 days of observations. She looked at him one more time. He couldn't tell what she was deciding, but she was deciding something. "I'll be in touch," she said. That night, after Mila was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his composition notebooks laid out in order. He was on the fourth one now, and he went through everything from the beginning, all of it. The time-stamped entries, the photographs on his phone, the anchor displacement measurements, the waveform screenshots he'd taken with his phone off the corridor monitoring panels. He organized it, cross-referenced it, made sure the dates and times were consistent, the data points documented in a way that would be legible to someone reviewing it fresh. Then he started a fifth notebook. Not for the ongoing monitoring. He'd keep that in the existing ones. This was different. This was a comprehensive summary, written not in the shorthand of field notes, but in the clear, structured language of a formal technical report. The kind that could be handed to an investigator, or a regulator, or if it came to that, a lawyer. He worked until nearly 1 in the morning. When he finally closed the notebook, his hand was cramped from writing and the apartment was very quiet. He could hear Mila's white noise machine running down the hall. He could hear the city outside, the low urban murmur that never quite went silent. He thought about Claire, the way he still did in the late-night hours, not with the sharp grief of the early years, but with something softer and more permanent, a presence that had simply become part of how he moved through the world. She would have had something to say about all of this, something practical and slightly impatient. Something like, "You know what to do. Stop waiting for someone to give you permission." He put the notebooks back in order on the shelf above the kitchen radiator. He didn't need permission. He never had. He just needed someone to listen. And he was starting to understand that if he waited for the right person to show up, he might be waiting until there was nothing left to listen to. On Friday, Marcus Holt sent an internal memo to the engineering staff declaring that all structural sensor anomalies were to be classified as instrumentation, maintenance issues pending the external calibration review scheduled for the following Thursday. On Friday evening, Priya Anand sent Elias a text message from her personal number. He'd given it to her 2 days ago when she'd asked, not entirely sure why, but now he knew. The text said, "They're not letting me take it to Diane. Marcus says it goes through him. I'm sorry. I tried." He read it twice, typed back, "I know. Thank you for trying. Keep your own copy of the overlay data." A pause, then, "Already did." He set his phone down on the kitchen counter. Outside the window, the city sat in its Friday night noise, indifferent to what was or wasn't happening inside a 43-floor building 6 miles away. In 3 years of watching this building, he'd documented what the building itself was trying to say, had been trying to say, apparently, for 14 months. He'd tried to tell the people responsible for listening. He'd been dismissed, redirected, and effectively silenced. He thought about the anchor bracket, the chalk mark, the fraction of a centimeter that shouldn't have moved. He opened his phone, found the number for the city's Office of Building Safety. It was 7:15 on a Friday. No one would answer. He'd have to leave a message or call back Monday. He called anyway. Got the after-hours voicemail. Left a clear, organized, specific message. His name, his contact number, the building address, the nature of the concern, the documentation he had available. He kept his voice level and precise, the way you did when you needed to be taken seriously and had approximately 60 seconds to establish that you were. He hung up. Then he poured himself a glass of water, turned off the kitchen light, and went to check that Mila's covers hadn't migrated to the floor in the way they always did by 10 o'clock. She was fine. She was sleeping with one arm flung out and a library book about suspension bridges face down on the pillow next to her. He picked up the book, marked the page, and set it on the nightstand. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but that was nothing new. The call back from the Office of Building Safety came on Monday morning at 8:47 while Elias was on the service elevator heading up to the 22nd floor. The inspector's name was Dale Ferris, and he had the voice of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to have heard every variety of complaint, concern, and outright paranoia that anxious citizens could produce. Polite, measured, neither warm nor cold. The voice of institutional patience. Mr. Mercer, I'm returning your message from Friday evening regarding Ashford and Vance at 1440 Caldwell Avenue. Yes, thank you for calling back. Elias shifted the phone to his other ear and pressed the button to hold the elevator at the 22nd floor landing. I have approximately 11 days of field observations and sensor data documentation indicating progressive displacement in the Northeast Foundation interface. The pattern is consistent with stress accumulation, and I believe it warrants a formal inspection. A pause. The sound of typing. And your role at the building is maintenance technician, 3rd year. Another pause, this one with a slightly different texture. I see. And the structural monitoring for the building, that's handled by the in-house engineering team at Ashford and Vance? It is. Have you brought these concerns to that team? 3 times in writing and twice verbally. The concerns have been classified as instrumentation error by the head of internal engineering, and no formal review has been initiated. More typing. Mr. Mercer, in situations like this, our standard process is to request the building's current inspection certification and structural monitoring logs from the owner of record before we dispatch an inspector. That process typically takes how long? 7 to 10 business days for the initial records request. If the documentation indicates cause for concern, we'd schedule a site assessment from there. Elias did the math in the silence of the held elevator. 7 to 10 days for the request, then additional time for review, then scheduling. He thought about the anchor bracket, the continuous vibration that was no longer tied to the drill cycles. Mr. Ferris, I understand the process. I want to make sure I'm being clear about the timeline I'm seeing on the ground. The rate of displacement has been increasing. I can't give you a specific date, but the pattern I'm documenting is not static. It's moving. I hear you. And the thing was, Ferris's voice did shift slightly. Just enough that Elias registered it. Not dismissal, something closer to professional discomfort. I'm going to flag your call in our system and move the records request to priority processing. That gets it to 5 business days. I appreciate it. I'd also recommend you continue your documentation. If you observe any accelerated change, visible cracking, audible, stress indicators, significant increases in the sensor readings, call us immediately. That triggers a different protocol. Understood. He let the elevator doors open and stepped out onto the 22nd floor, phone still at his ear. One more thing, Ferris said. You mentioned you've been pulling data off the corridor monitoring panels. Do you have any structural engineering background? I'm asking because the way you're describing this it's not how most maintenance staff describe building concerns. Elias thought about how to answer that for exactly 2 seconds. I have some background, yes. Okay. Another beat. Keep documenting, Mr. Mercer. I'll be in touch. He told himself he felt better after the call. He mostly believed it. The week moved the way weeks did. The accumulated small hours of routine work, the same floors, the same corridors, the same light fixtures and slow drains, and HVAC complaints. He kept his monitoring schedule on the northeast section with the regularity of someone who understood that the value of data was in its consistency. Every morning before his official shift started, every afternoon before he left. Displacement measurements on the anchor brackets, time stamps on the sensor readings, notes in the composition book. On Wednesday, the readings spiked. Not dramatically, not the kind of spike that would show up on anyone's alert dashboard, because the alert thresholds on the building's monitoring system had been set. He discovered this by looking at the configuration panel one afternoon, at a level that assumed normal operational variance. Nobody had updated the thresholds to account for a building adjacent to a deep excavation project. The spike would have looked, to the automated system, like weather noise. But to Elias, who knew what the baseline looked like and had been watching it move in one direction for nearly 2 weeks, it looked like the graph holding its breath. He photographed the panel reading. added it to the folder, made the note. That same Wednesday, he noticed something else, something that had nothing to do with the northeast wall. He'd been running a routine check on the server room access corridor on the 31st floor, a windowless stretch of hallway that housed the mechanical infrastructure for the executive floor systems, when he found a door that shouldn't have been left open. Not just unlocked, actually standing open a few degrees the way a door stands when whoever closed it wasn't paying full attention. It was the secondary records archive, a room he passed twice a week and had been inside exactly once, 2 years ago, to replace a faulty ceiling panel. It held physical backup filing systems, the kind of redundant paper documentation that most companies kept out of regulatory obligation and rarely looked at. He should have kept walking. That was the reasonable, keep your head down thing to do. Instead, he paused at the doorway. The light inside was on. Someone had been in here recently. There was a coffee cup on the table near the filing cabinets, still with coffee in it, which meant within the last couple of hours. Several of the cabinet drawers were open. A stack of files sat on the table in a way that suggested they'd been pulled and gone through in a hurry. He stood in the doorway for a moment, long enough to read the label on the tab of the top folder in the pile. It said, Foundation Assessments, NE Sector, Years 1 to 4. His pulse did something specific and unpleasant. He didn't touch anything. He stepped back into the corridor and kept walking, but he noted the time in his composition book. He called Priya that evening. The Northeast Foundation assessment files, he said when she picked up. The physical archive copies. Do you know if those have been accessed recently? A long pause. Why are you asking? The archive room on 31 was left open this afternoon. The files were out on the table. Another pause. He could hear her thinking. The particular silence of someone doing rapid calculations about what to say and how much. Elias. Her voice was lower now, quieter. I found something last week, in the archived sensor data, going back 2 years. Tell me. There are gaps. She exhaled. Short ones, 6-8 hours at a time, in the Northeast Sector monitoring logs. They're not system failures, Traub. The rest of the building data is continuous. These are targeted gaps, specific sensor strings, specific time windows. He sat down at the kitchen table without noticing he'd done it. Someone edited the archived records. But I don't know if edited is. I don't know what to call it. I don't know how to call it. But the gaps are there, and they correspond. She stopped. To what? The first gap is dated 17 months ago, 3 weeks after a site assessment report came back flagging early-stage microdisplacement concerns in the Northeast Sector. The kitchen was very quiet. Down the hall, Mila's white noise machine ran its low, steady hum. There's a report, he said. It wasn't a question. There was. I found a reference to it in a project index. The report itself is not in the system. The entry just says, superseded, see revised assessment. The revised assessment finds no structural concerns. Who authored the revised assessment? The pause that followed was the kind that had weight to it. The sign-off is Marcus Holt. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. Not surprised, exactly. He'd spent enough of his career around enough systems to know that the distance between institutional negligence and something more deliberate was often shorter than it should be. But there was something different about having a name. Priya. He kept his voice even. What I'm about to ask you is not a small ask, and you can say no. Ask. I need a copy of what you found. The gaps, the index entry, the revised assessment. Whatever you can document without putting yourself in a position that creates problems for you. Silence. Then, I've already saved copies, personal drive, not the work system. He let out a slow breath. Okay. Elias, what is this? Is this about the building or is this about something else? I think it might be both, he said. I think that's the problem. Thursday morning brought the external calibration review that Marcus had been referencing as the answer to all outstanding sensor concerns. A 2-person team from a third-party instrumentation company arrived at 9 o'clock with equipment cases and a project order signed by the head of internal engineering. Elias watched them check in from across the lobby. He watched them get into the elevator with Marcus and two junior engineers. He watched the floor indicator climb to 26. He went upstairs and did his job. By noon, word had circulated through the staff common area that the external team had completed their review and found no calibration issues. The sensors were functioning within specification. The anomalous readings had been attributed to interference from the adjacent construction site and would, the announcement implied, resolve themselves once the Delman excavation project moved to its next phase. Elias heard this from a facilities coordinator named Bev, who relayed it with the mild relief of someone who'd been vaguely worried about something she didn't fully understand and was glad to be done worrying about it. "So it was just the construction noise," she said, pouring coffee in the break room. "That's good, right? Better than the building having actual problems." "Right," he said. He smiled at her. She smiled back and left. He looked at his phone. He'd taken photos of the anchor brackets on 39 that morning. The displacement from his reference mark was now 2.5 millimeters. 2 weeks ago, it had been a fraction of 1. He went back to work. Bum. The thing about working in a building for 3 years was that you learned the rhythms of it. Not just the physical rhythms, not just the HVAC cycles and the elevator patterns, and the times when certain floors were quiet enough to hear your own footsteps, but the social ones. Who moved through which spaces at which times? Who worked late and who was always gone by 5? Which conversations happened in the open and which ones happened in the corners? He'd never paid particular attention to Graham Whitmore. The CFO occupied an office on the 42nd floor, 3 doors down from Victoria's, and existed in Elias's daily awareness mostly as a set of recurring requests: a desk lamp that needed a new bulb every few months, a private bathroom whose exhaust fan had been temperamental since winter. Whitmore was mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of someone who'd always been well-dressed and didn't think about it, with the practiced courtesy of an executive who understood that being pleasant to support staff cost nothing and occasionally paid off. Elias had always taken the pleasantness at face value because there had been no reason not to. But Thursday evening, doing a final pass on 42 before the end of his shift, he walked past Whitmore's office and registered, without quite meaning to, a fragment of the phone conversation happening inside. Not eavesdropping, just proximity and a door that was 3 inches short of fully closed. "Can't move the timeline up. The review is already scheduled, and if we push it, it flags." A pause. The low sound of Whitmore's voice, even and controlled. "I understand that, but the asset realignment has to clear compliance before the quarter closes, or it doesn't work." "Yes." Another pause. "Marcus understands what's at stake. He's handled his end." Elias kept walking. His footsteps made no sound on the carpet. He was not an accountant. He was not an auditor. He didn't know what asset realignment meant in the specific context of whatever Whitmore was managing, and he was very aware of the distance between what a person overhears in a hallway and what that fragment of conversation actually means when placed in its full context. But Marcus's name in Whitmore's mouth, in that tone, in the same week that a calibration review had closed the door on every structural concern. He wrote it down in his notebook, the time, the location, the exact words he'd retained, not because he knew what it meant, because it was a data point, and data points had a way of becoming meaningful in combination with other data points that were meaningless alone. He took the service elevator down, crossed the lobby, stepped out into the cold. Well, his father called that night, the regular Thursday call. "How's the building?" his father asked, by which he meant, how was everything? Which was how his father had always asked that question since the months after Claire died, when everything was the only word large enough to hold what needed to be asked. "Complicated," Elias said. A short silence. His father knew what that meant, in the way that parents of engineers knew what it meant when their children said the word complicated about something structural. It meant the problem was real, and the solution wasn't simple, and the person saying it had already been thinking about it for longer than they were letting on. "You still keeping your head down?" "Trying to." Elias. His father's voice had that specific register, not quite warning, not quite disappointment, somewhere between the two. "You know I'm not going to tell you to walk away from something you know is wrong." "I know." "But I'm also going to tell you, you've got a 7-year-old who needs you to still have a job next month." "I know, Dad." Okay. A beat. So what are you going to do? He looked at the notebooks on the shelf above the kitchen radiator. 11 of them now, counting the summary report. 3 years of this building, 14 months of a problem someone had been working very hard to make invisible. I'm going to keep documenting, he said, and I'm going to wait for someone with the authority to actually do something about it. And if that takes too long, then I'm going to make some noise. His father was quiet for a moment. Then, with the dry certainty of a man who'd spent 40 years around engineers, "You're already making noise. You just haven't been loud enough yet." The weekend was Mila's school science fair. She'd built a scale model of a cable-stayed bridge using materials from the hardware store and a set of load testing weights she'd made from stacked coins wrapped in electrical tape. She'd been working on it for 6 weeks, and it had taken over the kitchen table in stages the way serious projects always do, until the last week before the fair, when it was the only thing the kitchen table was for. Elias stood in the school gymnasium on Saturday afternoon and watched his daughter explain lateral load distribution to a visibly impressed teacher who kept nodding and saying, "Right, right," in the way of someone who was following about 70% of what was being said and didn't want to admit it. A parent standing next to Elias leaned over. "Is that your kid?" "Yeah." "She's been explaining that thing for 20 minutes. My son's been over there eating his display cookies." Elias laughed quietly. "She gets focused." Mila placed second overall. She was not gracious about it. On the way home, she explained at length and with specific technical citations why her bridge had outperformed the first-place entry on every structural metric and why the judging criteria were flawed. "You did great," he said. "I should have won." "Probably." She looked at him sideways. "You're supposed to say, it's not about winning. You built a load-tested cable-stayed bridge at 7 years old. You should probably win." She considered this for half a block. "I'm going to write a letter to the judges." "That's your right." "Will you help me with the technical parts?" "I'll look it over." They walked the rest of the way home in the cold afternoon air, her hand in his, the bridge model tucked under his other arm, and for those particular blocks, the rest of it was just noise. The worry and the data and the anchor brackets and the name in Whitmore's mouth. Just noise, held at a distance by the warm, specific weight of her hand. Monday brought 2 things. The first was an email from Dale Ferris at the Office of Building Safety. The initial records request had gone out to Ashford and Vance on Friday. Standard language. Request for current inspection certification, structural monitoring logs for the preceding 18 months, and any outstanding assessment reports. The second was that when Elias arrived on the 39th floor at 7:50 in the morning for his pre-shift monitoring check, the corridor panel on the northeast section was dark, not malfunctioning, not displaying an error, off. The panel had been switched off. He stood in front of the blank screen for a moment. Then he checked the neighboring panel, which was functioning normally. He checked the access panel on the wall, but still sealed, nothing indicating a maintenance job had been ordered. He checked the work orders in the morning briefing sheet. Nothing scheduled for Northeast Corridor equipment on 39. He photographed the dark panel, noted the time. Then he went to the physical mounting location of the sensor string for the Northeast section on 38, a junction box in the lower maintenance corridor, and found a flag tag on the main power switch. Yellow, the color used for administrative holds. Written on the tag in block letters, "Maintenance review pending. Do not activate." The tag was dated Saturday. He held the tag between 2 fingers and read it 3 more times, making sure he wasn't misreading it. Then he photographed it, wrote down every detail in the notebook, replaced the tag exactly where he'd found it, and walked back out of the lower corridor. His hands were steady. He was proud of that. He took the stairs to the 26th floor and knocked on the doorframe of Priya's workspace. She looked up from a set of drawings. He held up his phone and showed her the photograph of the blank panel. She looked at the photo. Then she looked at him. "When?" she asked. "Saturday." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who authorized it?" "The tag is unsigned, just a date." She turned back to her desk and typed something, then stopped. Read something on her screen. Her expression didn't change exactly, but the color of it did, in the way of someone absorbing information they'd been half expecting but still didn't want to be true. The monitoring log for the northeast section, she said quietly. It stopped updating Saturday at 2:14 in the afternoon. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. Elias, she kept her voice very low. Someone shut down the only sensor string that was catching what you've been documenting. I know. This isn't incompetence anymore. No, he said. It isn't. He straightened up from the doorframe. He had a full shift ahead of him. He had floors to clean and panels to check, and a building to listen to in the ways it could still be heard without the monitoring system that someone had just gone out of their way to silence. Keep your copies safe, he said. She nodded. He went back to work. The sensor string stayed dark for 4 days. Elias knew this because he checked the junction box on 38 every morning the same way he checked everything, quietly, systematically, without making a production of it. The yellow tag stayed on the power switch. The corridor panel on 39 stayed blank. And the building, indifferent to the administrative decision that had silenced the equipment meant to monitor it, kept doing what buildings under stress do. It kept moving. Without the panel data, he was working from physical observation alone. He spent his morning checks pressing his palm flat against the interior walls of the northeast corridor, the way a doctor uses their hands when the instruments aren't available. He measured the anchor brackets with a small steel rule he'd bought at a hardware store and kept in his shirt pocket. He logged everything with the same methodical consistency he'd maintained from the beginning, because the moment documentation became inconsistent was the moment it became dismissible. By Wednesday, the displacement on the third anchor from the left, the one he'd first marked with chalk on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks ago, had moved another full millimeter. The chalk mark was now so far from the anchor bracket that it looked almost like a mistake, like someone had marked the wrong spot. It wasn't a mistake. He photographed it, wrote it down, did the math in his head, which was the same math he'd been doing every day, and didn't like the answer any better than he had the day before. He called Dale Ferris from the stairwell on his lunch break. "The records request," he said, when Ferris picked up. "Has Ashford and Vance responded?" A pause, then the sound of a keyboard. "We received a partial response Friday afternoon. Current inspection certification, that's current, within spec. And the last 12 months of monitoring logs." 12 months. Correct. You requested 18. We did. Ferris's voice was professionally neutral, but there was something underneath it. "We've followed up requesting the full 18-month period. We're waiting on a response." "Mr. Ferris," Elias kept his voice steady. "The gap in the logs I referenced, the targeted gaps in the Northeast sector monitoring data, they begin 17 months ago. Whoever compiled that records response knew exactly where to stop." Silence on the other end. The particular silence of a civil servant registering a problem and deciding what to do with it. "I hear you," Ferris said finally. It was the same phrase he'd used on the first call, but this time it had more weight to it. "I'm going to escalate this internally. A formal non-compliance notice goes out if we don't receive the full records within 5 business days. That's a different conversation than a standard records request." What does a formal non-compliance notice trigger? A mandatory site assessment. Our timeline, not theirs. How long? Once the notice goes out, 72 hours for scheduling, then inspection within 10 business days after that. Elias did the math again, added the days, looked at the number they produced, and thought about the anchor bracket. "I'll keep documenting," he said. "Please do." He hung up and stood in the stairwell for a moment, the fluorescent light humming above him, the building making its sounds around him, the HVAC, the elevator cables, the low conversation of a structure under its daily load. He'd spent 3 years learning to read this building the way you learn to read a person. He knew its ordinary sounds. He knew what didn't belong. What he was hearing lately, in the quiet moments on the northeast side, was something that didn't belong. But Thursday morning, Priya found him. She came into the maintenance break room on the 24th floor at 7:15, which was unusual enough that he looked up from his coffee immediately. She had her personal laptop under her arm and the expression of someone who'd been up too late making decisions. She sat across from him and opened the laptop without saying hello. "I found the original assessment," she said, "the one that was replaced." He set his coffee down. It was archived on a legacy backup server that the IT team hasn't migrated yet. The file is dated 22 months ago. She turned the screen toward him. Dr. Nathan Cross. He was a senior structural engineer here at the time. The report documents early-stage microfracturing indicators in the Northeast Foundation interface and recommends a Phase 2 assessment within 60 days. Elias read the summary on the screen. His jaw tightened once and then went still. The language was precise, cautious, appropriately hedged in the way of responsible engineering reports. But the underlying message was unmistakable. Someone 22 months ago had seen what he was seeing now, earlier and less advanced, and had done exactly the right thing with it. "What happened to Dr. Cross?" he asked. Priya closed the laptop. He was let go 8 months after this report was filed. Corporate restructuring. His entire project team was dissolved. She paused. 2 other engineers from that team were also terminated in the same restructuring. Was the restructuring legitimate? I don't know. It might have been. Companies do restructure. She said it the way people say things they're not sure they believe. But the timing, 3 engineers gone within 8 months of a report that inconvenienced someone. She didn't answer that directly. There are 2 other names I found in the project index from that period, Vivian Tate and Ray Okafor. Both filed supporting assessments corroborating Cross's findings. Both were included in the restructuring. He sat with that for a moment. 3 engineers, people who'd done their jobs correctly, who'd documented a real problem accurately, who'd put their professional names on reports that said the uncomfortable true thing. And they'd been removed, and the reports had been buried, and the problem had been allowed to keep growing in the dark. He thought about the yellow tag on the power switch, the sensor string that had been shut off on a Saturday afternoon. "Who ordered the restructuring?" he asked. She looked at him. "It was signed off by Marcus Holt and countersigned by Graham Whitmore. Det." He needed to think, so he worked. That was how it had always been. The physical rhythm of the job creating the mental space that sitting still couldn't. He moved through his floors, did his checks, kept his hands occupied, and let the pieces turn over in his mind. What he had, assembled in its entirety, was this: a structural problem that had been identified by competent engineers 22 months ago, documented correctly, and then deliberately buried. The engineers who documented it had been removed from the company. The monitoring records had been selectively edited to remove the data that corroborated their findings. When the problem had resurfaced, through the ambient noise of the sensor system that had survived the editing, the head of internal engineering had labeled it instrumentation error, brought in a calibration team to formally confirm that label, and then shut down the one sensor string that was providing the clearest signal. All of that was the structural side. On the other side was the fragment of conversation he'd heard through Whitmore's barely closed door: asset realignment, compliance timelines, a quarter-close deadline. Marcus understands what's at stake. He didn't have enough to know what that meant in full, but he knew enough to know that whatever financial operation Whitmore was managing, it required the building to remain officially problem-free. An outstanding structural concern, especially one with documented engineering reports attached to it, would trigger regulatory scrutiny that would disrupt anything Whitmore needed to keep undisturbed. The structural cover-up and whatever was happening in the financial operations weren't 2 separate problems. They were the same problem wearing 2 faces. By the time he reached this conclusion, he was on the 38th floor northeast corridor, standing in front of the access panel where the sensor junction box lived. He hadn't planned to come here specifically. His feet had just brought him here, the way they sometimes did. He opened the access panel, looked at the yellow tag, looked at the power switch it was hanging from. Then he took out his phone and sent Priya a message. "I need everything you have in one place, one consolidated file. Everything. The gaps, the original Cross report, the names, the restructuring timeline, the revised assessment. Can you do that tonight?" Her response came back in 4 minutes. "Already started. Give me until tomorrow morning." He closed the access panel, put his phone away. Tomorrow morning. Damned. He was nearly at the end of his shift when Victoria Ashford found him. Not the other way around. Well, she came to him, which was unusual enough that he registered it as significant before she'd even opened her mouth. She appeared at the end of the northeast corridor on 39, dressed the same way she always was, moving with the same directed energy, but something in her bearing was slightly off from her usual register, a tension she was managing but not entirely hiding. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Ms. Ashford." She stopped a few feet from him, which was closer than she'd stood during their first conversation. She looked at the blank monitoring panel on the wall without quite meaning to, and then looked back at him. "I've been informed that you've been in contact with the city's Office of Building Safety," she said. He didn't bother asking how she'd found out. Records requests weren't confidential. "That's correct." Her expression didn't break, but something in it compressed slightly. "I want to understand your concern, directly, not through a facilities report." She said it like someone who'd decided that a thing she'd been avoiding was now unavoidable, and had resolved to approach it professionally. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the corridor conversation 3 weeks ago, the way she'd looked through him, the way she'd said you can leave your notes at the front desk with the practiced finality of someone who'd long ago delegated the job of being wrong so she wouldn't have to be. But she was here now. "The Northeast load-bearing section," he said, 37 through 43. "There's been progressive micro-displacement in the foundation interface for at least 17 months, possibly longer. The rate of displacement has been accelerating. The sensor string that was monitoring it most clearly was administratively disabled 4 days ago." He paused. "I've been documenting it since I first noticed it. I have extensive records." Victoria held his gaze. Her face was still controlled, but the control was doing more work than it had been. "Marcus's team determined it was a calibration issue," she said, but she said it the way you say something you're testing rather than asserting. "The calibration team found the sensors were functioning correctly," he said, "which means what the sensors were reading was accurate." A beat of silence. "The sensors were disabled," he said, "after the calibration team confirmed they were working." He watched her understand that, watched the sequence of it move across her face. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for dramatic, but it was there. The specific expression of someone whose map of a situation has just been quietly corrected, and who now has to decide what the new map means. "What are you telling me, Mr. Mercer?" "I'm telling you that there are engineering reports going back nearly 2 years that document this problem, that those reports were superseded by a revised assessment that found no concerns, and that the engineers who authored the original reports are no longer employed by this firm." He kept his voice entirely even. "I'm also telling you that the monitoring data that would have made those original reports impossible to dismiss has gaps in it that don't correspond to any system failure." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below them, an elevator cable hummed. Victoria Ashford stood very still. The kind of still that wasn't peace. It was the stillness of someone whose internal machinery was running very fast and whose external presentation was not keeping up. "You have documentation," she said, "of all of this." "I have 5 composition notebooks, approximately 300 photographs, sensor readings, displacement measurements, and a comprehensive summary report. I also have a colleague within the engineering team who has independently identified the log gaps and located the original assessment." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, exactly. More like the face of someone who has been standing in front of a locked door and has just been handed the key and is now deciding whether to use it. "Who else have you told?" "The Office of Building Safety. I'm the one who triggered the records request you received last week." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. "Why didn't you come to me directly?" "I tried." He said it without edge, just factually. 3 weeks ago, in this corridor, you told me to leave my notes at the front desk." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence entirely. Well, she asked him to come to her office the following morning. He said he would. He went home that night and found Mila at the kitchen table doing homework, a glass of orange juice at her elbow, and her backpack open on the chair beside her. The normalcy of it, the homework and the juice and the backpack, landed on him with the specific impact of ordinary things in the middle of extraordinary weeks. "How was school?" he asked. "Fine. We did fractions." She paused. "I don't understand why fractions matter." "Because everything is a fraction of something else," he said, hanging up his jacket. "The whole idea of a fraction is just saying, this thing is part of this bigger thing, and here's the proportion." She thought about it. Like how the northeast part of a building is a fraction of the whole building? He looked at her. What? You've been talking about the northeast part of the building for weeks. I can hear you on the phone sometimes. He sat down across from her. I didn't realize you could hear me. Our apartment is small, Papa. She said it gently, with the particular patience of a child who has learned to be patient with the adults around her. Is the building okay? He considered lying, the reflexive parental impulse to smooth things over, decided against it. It has a problem, he said. I've been trying to make sure the right people know about it. Are the right people listening now? I think one of them might be starting to. She absorbed this, turned back to her fractions. That's good, she said. He watched her work for a moment, her small hand moving the pencil, her forehead creased in concentration, the glass of juice sweating a ring onto the table. He thought about Nathan Cross and Vivian Tate and Ray Okafor, 3 engineers who'd done exactly the right thing and lost their jobs for it. He thought about what it meant to be seen and not seen, to have something true in your hands and no platform from which to say it. He got up and started dinner. The next morning, he arrived at Ashford and Vance 45 minutes before his shift began and took the elevator to 42. Victoria's assistant looked surprised to see him. He gave his name, said he had an 8 o'clock with Ms. Ashford, and was told to take a seat. He sat in the chair across from the assistant's desk, his composition notebooks in a canvas bag on his lap, and waited. He was good at waiting. At 8:05, the door opened. He stood, but it wasn't Victoria who appeared in the doorway. It was Marcus Holt, and he was not alone. Behind him stood a man Elias recognized from the lobby directory as the firm's general counsel, a tall, deliberate-looking man named Philip Crane. Mr. Mercer. Crane's voice was measured in a way that had clearly been prepared. I'm afraid Ms. Ashford has been called into an urgent board matter this morning. She asked me to meet with you in her place. Elias looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to Elias's left. Understood, Elias said. They moved to a small conference room off the executive corridor. Not Victoria's main conference room, a smaller one, no windows, the kind used for conversations you didn't want visible from the hallway. Elias set the canvas bag on the table and sat down. Crane sat across from him. Marcus sat to one side, and the energy around him was the specific energy of a man trying to look like he was there professionally and not managing to feel that way. We understand you have some documentation you'd like to share regarding building concerns, Crane said. Among other things, Elias said. Crane's expression registered that qualifier. What other things? Elias reached into the bag and set the first composition notebook on the table, then the second, then the third, fourth, and fifth, then the summary report, spiral-bound, 23 pages. He set his phone on the table beside them, open to the photo folder. 342 photographs, he said. Dated and time-stamped. Displacement measurements with a consistent methodology. Sensor panel readings, including readings taken before the Northeast monitoring string was administratively disabled 4 days ago. He paused. I also have documentation of the gaps in the archived sensor logs, the original cross-assessment, the employment records of the 3 engineers who were terminated after filing that assessment, and the revised assessment that replaced it. He looked at Crane directly. The revised assessment is signed by Marcus Holt. The room was very quiet. Marcus had gone a particular shade of still, the kind of still that comes after a body has registered a threat and is waiting to see what shape it takes. Where did you obtain the archived assessment? Crane asked. His voice had not changed tone. That was professional, and Elias gave him credit for it. It was located on a legacy backup server through standard internal access. I didn't obtain it. A member of the engineering team located it in the course of their own investigation. Crane wrote something on the yellow legal pad in front of him. The name of that team member? I'd prefer to keep that to myself for the moment. Crane looked at him. Mr. Mercer, I want to be clear about what this meeting is. Ms. Ashford has asked me to evaluate your concerns and determine the appropriate path forward. That's a genuine process, not a tune. Mr. Crane. Elias kept his voice entirely calm. With respect, the last time concerns about this building were formally evaluated internally, 3 engineers lost their jobs. The monitoring system that was producing the most relevant data was shut down days after the city requested records. I don't think it would be unreasonable for me to want a slightly wider audience for this conversation. A beat. Then Marcus, for the first time, spoke. You don't know what you're talking about. His voice had the strained quality of something that had been held in too long. You're a maintenance technician. You've been reading sensor panels in the hallway and writing in notebooks and acting like you understand what any of it means. The displacement on the third anchor bracket in the northeast lower corridor is currently 4 millimeters from my original reference mark, Elias said. Flat. Factual. When I made that mark, it was less than 1. The rate of change has been accelerating for 2 weeks. If you want to tell me what that means, I'm listening. Marcus stopped talking. Crane looked at Marcus. It was a brief look, but it held a specific quality. The look of a lawyer recalibrating, very quickly, what he'd been told about this meeting before he walked into it. The door opened. Victoria Ashford came in. She was not pulled into a board meeting. She'd been standing on the other side of the door, and she walked in now with the expression of someone who'd heard enough of what she needed to hear. She stood at the head of the table and looked at Marcus for a long moment. "Step out," she said. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her face and didn't. He got up and left the room. The door closed behind him. Victoria sat down. She looked at the notebooks on the table, 5 of them in a row, a wall of careful documentation. And then she looked at Elias. "I owe you an apology," she said. She said it plainly, without the softening language people usually wrap apologies in. "I dismissed you in that corridor, and I shouldn't have." He waited. "Tell me everything," she said. So he did. He started at the beginning. The first day he'd noticed the vibration change, the first time he'd pulled the corridor panel data, the chalk mark on the anchor bracket. He walked through the documentation in the notebooks chronologically, cross-referencing with the photographs, explaining the technical significance of each data point in language that was clear but didn't condescend. He told her about Priya's discovery of the log gaps and the legacy backup file. He told her about Nathan Cross and the suppressed report. He told her about Vivian Tate and Ray Okafor. He did not tell her about the fragment of Whitmore's phone call. Not yet. He wanted the structural story to stand on its own first. Victoria listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both technical, both specific, and accepted his answers without challenge. When he finished, the room was quiet. Crane, who had been taking notes for the past 40 minutes, set down his pen. Victoria looked at the summary report. She looked at the stack of notebooks. She looked at the 342 photographs on his phone. "The Office of Building Safety," she said. "What's their current status?" "They've issued a formal records request. Ashford and Vance submitted 12 months of logs when 18 were requested. They followed up. If they don't receive the full records, a non-compliance notice triggers a mandatory site assessment within 2 weeks." Victoria absorbed this. If they do a site assessment, they'll find what I've been documenting, probably more once they have proper equipment on site. He paused. "The building isn't in imminent collapse. I want to be clear about that, but it has a problem that has been growing for nearly 2 years, and the rate of growth is accelerating. The longer it goes unaddressed, the more the options narrow." Crane leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you directly. Who else have you shared this documentation with outside of Ashford and Vance and the Office of Building Safety?" "I've kept a copy of the full documentation off-site," Elias said, "in the event that the documentation I've maintained at the building were to become inaccessible." Crane and Victoria exchanged a look. "That was a precaution," Elias added quietly. "It was a smart one," Victoria said. She didn't say it warmly. She said it like a woman looking at the full shape of a situation and recognizing each of its contours, including the ones that reflected badly on her own firm. She stood up, straightened her jacket. The motion had the quality of someone making a decision and anchoring it in their body. "Philip," she said, "I need you to freeze access to all Northeast Sector documentation, all archived records from the past 24 months, and all personnel files related to the cross-team restructuring, effective immediately." She looked at Elias. "I also need the name of the board's external auditor." "That would be Hartwell Associates," Crane said. "Call them." she picked up one of the composition notebooks, the third one, the thickest, and held it. "I want them in this building by end of week." She walked toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. She turned back to look at Elias, and there was something in her expression that she hadn't allowed herself in the corridor 3 weeks ago. Something that wasn't yet comfortable to hold. The look of a person who has discovered the cost of their own inattention. "How long have you worked in this building?" she asked. 3 years. She nodded once, slowly. Then she walked out. Elias sat alone at the conference table for a moment, the notebooks laid out in front of him, the building making its sounds around him. He thought about what would happen next. The auditors, the board, the structural assessment, the questions that would be asked about the 3 engineers, and the suppressed reports, and the phone call in Whitmore's office. He thought about how much of that would be messy and slow and imperfect, because real institutions in real trouble didn't fix themselves cleanly. He also thought about the northeast wall, the anchor bracket, the reading he'd taken this morning that he hadn't told anyone yet, because there hadn't been the right moment, that put the displacement at 4.5 millimeters. He put the notebooks back in the canvas bag, picked up his phone. He had a shift to finish. Hartwell Associates sent 3 people. They arrived Thursday morning in the quiet way that external auditors always arrived. No announcement in the building's internal communications, no email to staff, just 3 people with rolling cases and professional faces checking in at the lobby security desk at 8:15. Elias saw them from across the lobby while he was signing in for his shift. He recognized the type before he read the company name on their visitor badges. He'd worked around enough investigations in his career to know the particular stillness of people who'd been hired to find things and already suspected what they were going to find. He went upstairs and did his job. By mid-morning, word had moved through the building in the way that unsuppressible things move, not through any official channel, just through the accumulated small observations of people who worked in the space every day. Someone had seen the auditors on the 31st floor, the records archive floor. Someone else had seen them with Philip Crane in one of the executive conference rooms. A facilities coordinator told Bev, who told 2 people in the engineering bullpen, and within 3 hours there was a particular tension in the 42nd floor hallways that Elias could feel when he took the service elevator up for his afternoon check. The tension had a specific shape. It was the shape of people who knew something was being examined and were not sure what the examination would find, or whether they were adjacent to it. He passed Graham Whitmore's office at 2:30. The door was fully closed. He noted that. In 3 years, he'd rarely seen that door fully closed in the middle of a working afternoon. Priya texted him at 4:17. "They asked for my analysis. I showed them everything, the gaps, the cross-file, the overlay. They had a forensic data person with them. She was already asking about the archive server before I finished explaining." He read the message twice, standing in the stairwell on the 24th floor. Then he typed back, "How did it go?" 3 dots. Then, "Honestly?" They barely reacted, like they'd already seen this kind of thing before. That was scarier than if they'd seemed surprised. He understood that. Professionals who specialized in institutional deception developed a specific economy of expression, not because they were indifferent, but because surprise was a luxury that slowed the work. He pocketed his phone and continued down the stairs. The structural assessment team came the following morning, Friday, dispatched by the Office of Building Safety after the non-compliance notice had been issued the day before. 2 licensed structural engineers and an inspector, with proper access credentials, and a formal site order that meant they didn't need Ashford and Vance's cooperation to proceed, though Victoria had, according to a brief message she had her assistant pass to the facilities department, authorized full access. Elias was assigned to accompany them. Not officially. The assignment came verbally through his department head, who said it with the slightly mystified tone of a man following instructions he didn't fully understand. But the effect was that Elias spent Friday moving through the building with the inspection team, showing them what he'd been showing himself for weeks. The lead engineer's name was Sandra Osei. She was compact and direct, with the kind of face that gave nothing away while her eyes took in everything. She carried her own field notebook, the proper kind, the engineer's field book with the water-resistant cover, and wrote in it continuously, the way Elias wrote in his. When she saw the anchor bracket on the northeast lower corridor, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She crouched down, measured it herself with her own equipment, read the measurement, and wrote it down. Then she stood up and looked at him. "You've been tracking this how long?" "The bracket specifically, 3 weeks. The sensor data going back further. And your background is maintenance technician," he said. She looked at him for the same extra beat that Priya had looked at him, that Dale Ferris had implied with his silence on the phone, the beat of someone updating their assessment mid-stride. "Right," she said, and moved on to the next location. By early afternoon, Osei and her team had worked through the northeast section from the basement to 43. They'd pulled the access panels, reviewed the junction boxes, taken their own displacement measurements, and compared them to Elias's records, which he'd given them copies of, the full set, everything in order. They'd spent 20 minutes at the disabled monitoring panel on 39 and another 15 reviewing the junction box with the yellow-tagged power switch. Osei pulled the yellow tag off the switch, read it, photographed it, put it in an evidence bag she produced from her case with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this particular motion before. "Administrative hold," she said. It wasn't a question. "Place Saturday. No work order, no documented authorization." She wrote in her notebook. At the end of the afternoon, she stood with Elias in the northeast lower corridor on 38, the same corridor where he'd first pressed his palm to the wall 3 weeks ago, where the vibration had first told him something was wrong. She was looking at her tablet, reviewing the day's collected data. "Mr. Mercer," she said without looking up, "what's your honest assessment of the timeline?" He appreciated that she asked it directly. He gave her a direct answer. "Based on the rate of displacement acceleration I've documented, we're not talking about days. But if the rate continues on its current curve, the margin for comfortable remediation starts narrowing significantly within a few weeks. After that, you're looking at more invasive intervention." She nodded, still looking at her tablet. "That's consistent with what I'm seeing." She looked up. "The good news is that the problem has been caught at a stage where it's still manageable. The bad news is that it should have been caught 18 months ago." She said it without drama, the way professionals state facts that have obvious implications. "Yes," Elias said, "it should have." She closed the tablet cover. "You'll be hearing from us formally early next week. In the meantime, I'm recommending to the building owner that the northeast section above floor 35 be placed on occupancy restriction pending remediation planning. Victoria Ashford has already been notified." He absorbed this. "How many people does that affect?" "Roughly 60 workstations, the conference suite, and 4 executive offices." She paused. "Including the CFO's office." He said nothing. She looked at him again with that same evaluating quality. "There are going to be questions in the formal process about how this documentation exists and why the building's own engineering team didn't catch it. Your records are going to be part of that conversation." "I know. Is there anything in them that you're not comfortable having scrutinized?" He thought about it genuinely, which was the only honest way to answer. 3 weeks of early mornings and lunch breaks and end-of-shift checks, 342 photographs, 5 composition notebooks. The kind of documentation that existed because he'd been trained to document things correctly, because accuracy was a professional habit that didn't turn off just because nobody was evaluating it. "No," he said. "Nothing." She nodded once. "Good." The weekend was quiet in the way of weekends that carry weight. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended. The city did its weekend things around him and Mila, and he did what he could to be present for the part of his life that was still simple. Saturday afternoon, they went to the public library, which was one of their recurring rituals. Mila loading up a bag with more books than she could reasonably read in 2 weeks, and him walking the engineering section for 10 minutes longer than he needed to. He stood in front of a row of structural analysis textbooks and felt, for the first time in some days, a kind of equilibrium. Not resolution, things were not resolved, but the particular steadiness that comes when you've done what you could do and handed the rest to the process. Mila appeared at his elbow, with 8 books in her arms and a 9th balanced on top. "Can I get one more?" she asked. "Where would you put it?" "On my face." He took the stack from her before the top book fell. "Let's start with these." On the walk home, she asked him, with the sudden lateral thinking that was one of her most reliable qualities, whether engineers made mistakes. All the time, he said. Big ones? Sometimes. What do they do when that happens? He thought about this for half a block. Good ones own it. They document what went wrong, figure out why, and make it part of what they know going forward. What do the bad ones do? They try to make the mistake disappear. She was quiet for a moment, processing. That seems like it would make things worse. It always does, he said. Mistakes don't disappear. They just get more expensive the longer you wait. She shifted the bag of books to her other shoulder. Like a building. He looked at her. Exactly like a building. Monday brought things that had been building toward arrival. He was summoned to a meeting at 9 o'clock that turned out to include Victoria Ashford, Philip Crane, the two Hartwell auditors who were handling the financial review, and a woman he didn't recognize who introduced herself as Renata Bloom, representing the firm's board of directors. The meeting was in the large conference room, the one with windows, the one that looked out over the city. Elias sat down and folded his hands on the table and waited. "I'll get directly to it," Bloom said. She was older, with a precision about her that reminded him of the best project managers he'd worked with, someone who'd learned that clarity was a form of respect. "The board has been reviewing the documentation that Ms. Ashford brought to our attention last week. Alongside that, Hartwell Associates has been conducting a concurrent financial review. What I'm going to share with you today is preliminary, but it's sufficient for the decisions that need to be made." She opened a folder. The structural monitoring logs for the Northeast sector were selectively edited across a period of 14 months. 17 specific data windows were removed or compressed to below reporting threshold. The original cross-assessment has been recovered from the backup server. 3 engineers, Nathan Cross, Vivian Tate, and Raymond Okafor, were terminated from this firm within 8 months of that assessment's filing. The terminations were processed under a corporate restructuring action authorized by Marcus Holt and countersigned by Graham Whitmore. Elias kept his expression still. He knew all of this. Hearing it stated by a board representative in a formal meeting, however, had a different weight than knowing it in a hallway. On the financial side, Bloom continued, Hartwell has identified a pattern of asset transfers and reclassifications in the Northeast Corridor renovation project budget spanning the same period. A portion of the capital allocated for structural maintenance and monitoring upgrades was redirected to a series of accounts that are currently under review. The amounts involved are significant. She looked up from the folder. Mr. Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave as of this morning, pending the completion of the financial investigation. The room was quiet. Victoria was looking at the table, not with the controlled executive expression she usually wore, with something rawer, the face of a person reckoning with the distance between what she'd trusted and what had actually been happening. Mr. Mercer, Bloom said, the documentation you provided has been integral to establishing the timeline of both the structural and financial issues. Your records are the most comprehensive, consistent account of what this building has been doing over the past 3 weeks, and they corroborate the engineering data that our structural consultants have since confirmed. She paused. I want to be direct with you about what the board is asking. Please be, he said. We're asking for your cooperation in formally documenting the full timeline for the board investigation. That means sitting with our attorneys and walking through your records in detail. It means being available to the Office of Building Safety as their assessment continues. It may eventually mean being available for legal proceedings if this reaches that point. She held his gaze. We recognize that's a significant ask of someone who is not and was not required to do any of this. He thought about what he wanted before he answered. He'd been thinking about it for days, which was the same as saying he'd been thinking about it since the morning in the corridor when Victoria had told him to leave his notes at the front desk. I'll cooperate fully, he said. I have one request. Bloom nodded. Name it. Nathan Cross, Vivian Tate, and Raymond Okafor. He said the names carefully because names mattered. Their terminations were connected to reports they filed correctly and professionally. Their careers were affected. I want the board to formally review the circumstances of their terminations and address the professional record implications. Bloom looked at him steadily. You're asking for their reputations back. I'm asking for the record to reflect what actually happened. What they did was right. What happened to them as a result was not. The room was quiet for a moment. Bloom wrote something in her folder. That's a reasonable request. She looked up. And I want to be honest with you. It's the kind of request that tells us something about why you brought this forward in the first place. Victoria spoke for the first time in the meeting. Her voice was controlled but had a slight roughness to it, like something that had been smoothed down but still had texture underneath. Is there anything else you need from us? He thought about it. The Northeast monitoring system needs to be restored before anything else, whatever is happening on the investigation side. The building doesn't wait for that. Sandra Osei had said the same thing on Friday with the same flat urgency. Bloom nodded. The monitoring system was restored this morning at 6:30, she said. The occupancy restriction on the Northeast section is in effect. We've engaged a remediation contractor for a preliminary site assessment starting Wednesday. He absorbed this. Good. We're also... Victoria stopped, started again. We're exploring whether there's a role here that better suits your actual background, Mr. Mercer. Philip has looked at your credentials, your work at Carver, your time at the infrastructure consultancy in Pittsburgh, your licensure record. She met his eyes directly. I had a conversation with the senior partner at your former firm in Pittsburgh. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, that you were the best problem identifier he'd ever worked with. Elias said nothing. That's not a small thing to say, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. He wasn't ready to answer whatever the implicit question was. It was too early, and there were too many other things that had to settle first. But he let the statement sit in the room without deflecting it, which was more than he'd let himself do in some years. Darn it. Marcus Holt's termination was processed that afternoon. Elias heard about it the same way he heard most things. Not from any official source, but from the building's ambient information system, the accumulated overheard fragments and shared glances of people who worked in close proximity. By 3 o'clock, the engineering bullpen on 26 had the particular quality of a space that had just received significant news and was still processing it. He stopped by Priya's desk. She looked up. Her face had a complicated expression, relief and discomfort mixed, which was the honest face of someone who'd done a hard thing and hadn't expected it to feel entirely clean. You okay? He asked. I don't know yet. She turned her chair slightly toward him. Marcus wasn't a bad person. Not the way I'd imagined a villain when I was a kid. He was just... She searched for the word. Convenient. He did what was convenient for the people above him and called it management. Elias nodded. He'd known people like Marcus for his entire career. The ones who weren't cruel by nature, just professionally flexible in directions they shouldn't be flexible. The ones who convinced themselves that accommodation was pragmatism. You did the right thing, he said. I know. She didn't say it with confidence exactly. More like someone affirming a fact they knew was true, but that felt complicated in practice. I keep thinking about Cross, about Tate and Okafor. How many times someone probably told them the same thing and it didn't actually fix anything for them? It might now, he said. She looked at him. Is that what you asked for? It's what I asked for. She held that for a moment, then she nodded. A small, deliberate nod, the kind that meant something. For what it's worth, she said, I looked at your old project files from when you were here before you came back as maintenance. She paused. The bridge assessment you led in year 2, the Clearwater overpass. The methodology you used is still referenced in the firm's internal standards manual. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. Nobody connected the name, she said. The Elias Mercer in the old project files and the Elias Mercer who fixes the HVAC. No, he said. Nobody did. She turned back to her screen. He straightened up from the doorframe. Thank you, Priya, he said, for taking it seriously when it mattered. She didn't look up, but something in her posture acknowledged it. Thank you for not giving up when you should have. He took the long route home that evening, not for any specific reason. The train was running fine. The weather had cleared into a cold, clean afternoon, but because he needed the time between the building and his front door to decompress in a way that the train didn't entirely allow. He walked 8 blocks instead of 3 before descending to the platform, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the city do its early evening things. He thought about the Clearwater overpass methodology, sitting in a standards manual with his name on it, in a firm where nobody had known he was walking the hallways for 3 years. He didn't know exactly how to feel about that. He wasn't sure it was something that required a specific feeling. It was just the shape of what had happened, the particular way a life could double back on itself without announcing it. He thought about Nathan Cross, about what it would mean to a person, after years of a professional record that had been quietly damaged, to have a board formally acknowledge what had actually happened. He didn't know if it would be enough. He didn't know if enough was even a category that applied. Some things that were taken couldn't be fully given back, just acknowledged, which was not the same thing but was sometimes the most honest version of repair available. He thought about Mila, who was probably home from her after-school program, making herself a snack she was technically allowed to make and eating it in front of a library book about suspension bridges. He took the stairs down to the platform 2 at a time. The train was just arriving. He was right about the snack. She'd made herself toast with peanut butter, an authorized snack, and was sitting at the kitchen table with the suspension bridges book open to a chapter on cable tension calculations, eating with one hand and tracing the diagram with the other. She looked up when he came in. "Did you fix the building today?" He hung up his jacket, thought about the most honest way to answer. "Today people started fixing it properly," he said. "That's different from me fixing it." She considered the distinction. "But you started it. I documented it. Other people had the authority to actually act on it. But without your documentation, they wouldn't have known." She said it with the logic of someone for whom the sequence was obvious. "That's fair," he said. She turned a page in the book. "So you did the part that made everything else possible." He stood at the kitchen counter for a moment. Outside the window, the city was settling into its evening light, the buildings going amber in the late sun, and his daughter was at the table eating toast and explaining his own situation back to him with the unadorned clarity of a 7-year-old who hadn't learned yet to complicate the things that weren't complicated. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I did." He opened the refrigerator and started thinking about dinner, and for a few ordinary minutes the rest of it stayed where it belonged, in the building, in the notebooks, in the meetings that would continue next week and the week after, and probably several weeks after that. The real and unfinished business of institutions working through the consequences of their own failures, slow and imperfect and necessary. Here, there was just the kitchen and the amber light and a girl who thought cable tension was interesting enough to trace with her finger. He put a pot of water on for pasta. "Papa," Mila said, without looking up from the book, "did you know the longest cable-stayed bridge in the world is in China?" "I did know that." "The cables have to be tensioned exactly right, or the whole deck oscillates." "That's correct." She looked up. "How do you know all this stuff?" He reached for the box of pasta in the cabinet. Outside, the city noise continued, the ongoing indifferent hum of a place that didn't particularly notice what happened in any one building on any one street in any one week. "I used to work with buildings," he said. She stared at him. "You work with buildings now." "Different kind of work." She tilted her head, the left tilt, the one that meant she was adding something to an existing calculation. "Are you going to go back to the other kind?" He hadn't answered that question yet, even to himself. It was still sitting in the conference room with Renata Bloom's careful voice and Victoria Ashford's complicated expression, waiting for the dust to settle enough that he could see the shape of what came next. "Maybe," he said. She accepted this and went back to her book. He stood at the stove and watched the water begin to move. The remediation contractor arrived on Wednesday, the same day the Northeast occupancy restriction went into full effect. Elias watched from the lower maintenance corridor as the crew moved their equipment into the basement access points. Heavy injection rigs, core sampling tools, the kind of machinery that meant a problem was finally being handled at the level it actually existed. There was nothing elegant about it. The basement smelled like concrete dust and machine oil, and the crew moved with the unhurried efficiency of people who dealt in structural reality rather than the polished surfaces above it. One of the crew leads stopped to ask Elias where the utility shutoffs were, and he showed him, and the man thanked him and moved on without ceremony, which felt exactly right. The building was finally being listened to. That was enough. Upstairs, the formal processes were grinding forward with the particular speed of institutions that had been startled into urgency. The Hartwell financial team had expanded their scope after the initial findings. 2 more auditors had arrived Tuesday, and the 31st floor archive room that Elias had once paused at a doorway to read a folder label had become a secured review space with a keypad entry that hadn't been there before. Philip Crane was in and out of meetings constantly, his expression the contained grimness of a lawyer managing a situation that was larger than originally estimated. Graham Whitmore had not returned to the building after his administrative leave was announced. His office on 42 sat dark and closed, and the particular absence of him had its own quality, not triumphant, just empty, the way a space feels when something that was filling it is no longer there. Marcus Holt's departure had been processed with more visible disruption. He'd had a team, people who'd built their work routines around his, and the engineering bullpen on 26 had the unsettled atmosphere of a place reorganizing itself. Priya had been asked to take on additional coordination responsibilities, which she'd accepted with the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone who hadn't planned for a promotion to arrive this way. Elias moved through all of it doing his job. He kept his monitoring schedule on the Northeast section even after the professional assessment team took over the formal documentation. Not because he didn't trust their work, but because 3 weeks of habit had its own momentum, and because the building didn't stop talking just because the right people had finally started listening. The formal interview with the board's attorneys happened on Thursday. He sat across from 2 lawyers in a conference room on the 38th floor, a neutral floor, away from both the executive tier and the engineering bullpen, with his 5 composition notebooks open on the table and his phone's photo folder accessible. The lead attorney was a woman named Constance Vera, thorough and unhurried, with the quality of someone who had learned to read documents and people simultaneously and found both equally interesting. They went through everything in chronological order. She asked precise questions and he gave precise answers. When he wasn't certain of something, he said so. When a notation in the notebooks needed explanation, he explained it. The session lasted 4 hours with 1 break, during which he drank bad conference room coffee, and she made phone calls he couldn't hear from the hallway. At the end, she closed her own notebook and looked at him. "I want to ask you something that's not strictly within the scope of this interview," she said. "Go ahead." At any point in this process, when you filed the concern reports and got no response, when you were told to stop accessing monitoring data, when the sensor string was shut off, did you consider just walking away from it? He thought about it honestly. Yes. She waited. There's a version of events where I calculated the cost of continuing, losing the job, the disruption to my daughter's routine, the likelihood that nothing I did would actually change anything, and I walked away. He turned a pen over in his fingers. I thought about it seriously, more than once. What stopped you? He took a moment with the question because it deserved a real answer rather than a tidy one. I've spent my career in structural engineering. The whole job fundamentally is understanding how things bear weight, what holds and what doesn't, and why. He paused. When you know something is wrong with the thing you're responsible for understanding, and you don't say it, you don't just become useless, you become part of the failure. He looked at her. I couldn't be part of the failure. Not that specific failure. Constance Vera looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, closed her folder, and thanked him for his time. Nathan Cross called on Friday afternoon. Elias was in the maintenance break room eating a sandwich when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't pick up. He picked up. Is this Elias Mercer? The voice was male, mid-50s, careful, a voice that had been rehearsing this call. It is. A short pause. My name is Nathan Cross. I was a senior structural engineer at Ashford and Vance until about 20 months ago. I received a call from a board representative this week, Renata Bloom. Another pause. She told me about the review, about what you found. Elias set down the sandwich. Dr. Cross. Nate is fine. The careful quality in his voice didn't fully relax, but something in it shifted, like a door opening a few inches. I've been sitting with this for a couple of days trying to figure out what I wanted to say. To be honest, I'm still not entirely sure. Take your time. A short, slightly surprised exhale. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent. Bloom told me the board is formally reviewing the terminations, that they're acknowledging the connection between the cross-assessment and the restructuring. He paused. She used the word wrongful. I haven't heard that word in an official context in 20 months. Elias said nothing. Some things needed to be held rather than responded to. I want you to know, Cross said, that after we were let go, after Vivian and Ray and I were let go, we tried. We filed with the licensing board, we talked to an attorney, we tried to put together a formal complaint. But without the documentation, without the archived report, without the monitoring logs, he stopped. You can't fight what you can't prove. We knew what had happened. We just couldn't prove it. The documentation exists now, Elias said. Yes. Bloom explained that. A pause. She told me you specifically requested that the board address our terminations as part of your cooperation agreement. I did. Why? The question wasn't suspicious. It was the question of someone who'd been living in a landscape where that kind of consideration was so rare that its presence required explanation. Elias thought about how to say it. Because you were right, he said finally. Your report was accurate. What happened to you for writing it was wrong. That didn't need to be part of a negotiation. It just needed to be said. The line was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he'd lost the call. Then Cross said quietly, Do you know what it does to you? Professionally? When something like that happens? When you do your job correctly and it's used to end your career? I have some idea, Elias said, not elaborating, letting it stand at that. Vivian left the industry entirely, Cross said. She's teaching high school physics now. She says she's happy, and I believe her, but he stopped. Ray's been doing independent consulting, small jobs. He could be doing more, but the gap in his record, the circumstances of the termination, it follows you. People ask questions. You can explain until you're tired of explaining, and some people believe you, and some people are already moving on to the next candidate. The break room was quiet. Elias could hear the building around him, the ordinary working sounds of a Thursday afternoon, the elevator, the HVAC, the muffled telephone conversations on the floor above. I can't give you the 20 months back, Elias said. The board can acknowledge what happened, and that's meaningful, but it doesn't give you the 20 months. No, Cross said, it doesn't. A beat. But it's something. After 20 months of nothing, it's not a small something. They talked for another 20 minutes. Not about the investigation, about the original assessment, about what Cross had seen and when he'd seen it, about the specific technical judgment calls that had led to his conclusions. It was the conversation of two engineers comparing notes on a problem they'd both been working from different angles, and it had a straightforwardness that the weeks of institutional process had mostly lacked. Cross asked specific questions about the anchor displacement measurements, and Elias walked him through the methodology, and Cross said the rate of change was consistent with what he'd modeled in the original report and had frankly been worse than he'd hoped when he'd allowed himself to think about it. The good news, Elias said, is that the remediation team has been on site since Wednesday. They're doing core sampling today. The preliminary assessment is that it's addressable without structural replacement. Cross exhaled. That's genuinely good news. Your report made it possible to catch it at that stage. A silence. 22 months later. 22 months later, Elias agreed. But not later than that. Vivian Tate called the following Tuesday. She was different from Cross in her manner. Quicker to speak, less guarded, with an energy that came through the phone as someone who'd made peace with something and then found that the peace was being disturbed in a way that was complicated but not entirely unwelcome. She was indeed teaching high school physics. She taught in a public school in a district 40 miles from the city, had been doing it for 14 months, and when she talked about her students, she talked about them the way engineers talked about problems they found genuinely interesting. I don't miss the corporate side, she said plainly. I thought I would. I was devastated when it happened. I won't pretend otherwise. But the thing I actually missed was the work, the physics of it. And I'm doing that here, just with 17-year-olds instead of load diagrams. Do you want to come back to it? Elias asked. Professionally? A pause. I don't know. Bloom's call stirred things up. There's a version of this where having the record corrected opens a door I'd stopped standing in front of. She was quiet for a moment. I haven't decided. That's your decision to make. Yes. Then, was it hard? Doing what you did? Not the technical part. The decision part. Choosing to keep pushing when it would have been easier to let it go. He thought about the stairwell phone calls, the yellow tag on the power switch. The morning he'd taken the displacement measurement and gotten a number that confirmed what he'd been hoping wasn't true. It was hard in a specific way, he said. It's not that it was hard to decide to do it. It was hard to do it without knowing if it would matter. You don't get to see the outcome while you're making the choice. You just make the choice and keep going. That's a lonely thing, she said. It is, he agreed. She thanked him. He told her that the thanks belonged to the three of them for writing the report correctly in the first place, which he meant sincerely, and she said, "That's an engineer's answer," and laughed. And it was a good laugh, the kind that meant something real had been said. Raymond Okafor sent a brief email. He wasn't a phone person, which the two-sentence note made clear. It said, "I heard what you did and what you asked for. You didn't have to do that. Thank you." That was all, no signature beyond his name. It was in its brevity one of the more complete things Elias received that week. The board's formal findings were issued 3 weeks later. Elias received a copy via Philip Crane, delivered in a sealed envelope to the facilities department with his name on it, which was a formality he found slightly absurd given everything but appreciated in its way. He opened it at the kitchen table after Mila had gone to school, with his first cup of coffee, in the morning quiet that he'd always found easier for reading things that required full attention. The document was 41 pages. He read all of it. The findings confirmed the structural cover-up in formal, legal language, the suppression of the cross-assessment, the selective editing of the monitoring logs, the unauthorized disabling of the Northeast sensor string. They confirmed the connection between these actions and the financial irregularities in the building maintenance budget. They confirmed that the terminations of Nathan Cross, Vivian Tate, and Raymond Okafor were connected to the filing of the original structural assessment and had not been carried out for legitimate restructuring purposes. Graham Whitmore was named in the financial findings with the specificity of someone who had run out of room to hide behind institutional process. The amounts involved were substantial, redirected capital that had been systematically siphoned from maintenance and monitoring budgets over 3 years, funneled through a series of reclassifications that had been signed off at the CFO level and enabled at the operational level by Marcus Holt's management of the engineering team. Marcus's name appeared 11 times in the document. It was not a document that left ambiguity about roles. The board's formal remediation commitments included the structural repairs, which were already underway. They also included a professional record correction for Cross, Tate, and Okafor, a formal board statement acknowledging the wrongful circumstances of their terminations and the accuracy of their original assessment, which would be filed with the State Engineering Licensing Board and made available to any prospective employer who requested it. The financial scheme was being referred to the appropriate regulatory authorities. Near the end of the document, in a section on internal process reform, there was a paragraph about the building monitoring protocol. A new requirement: all structural anomaly reports filed by any building staff member, regardless of their role, were to be reviewed by a licensed structural engineer within 5 business days. The change was simple. It was also the kind of simple change that could have prevented everything documented in the preceding 40 pages. He put the document down and drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold while he was reading. He thought about the distance between a problem and its acknowledgement, how long that distance could be, and how many people could exist in the space between. People who saw clearly and documented carefully and still couldn't force the gap to close on their own. Nathan Cross had written a correct report, and it had cost him his career. 3 weeks of Elias's early mornings had eventually forced the right questions into the right rooms, but it had taken the right questions landing in front of the right person at a moment when she was finally ready to hear them. Victoria Ashford mattered. Priya mattered. Dale Ferris mattered. The system, imperfect and slow as it was, had ultimately moved. None of it had been clean. None of it had been fast. Some of the damage was permanent in ways the 41-page document couldn't reach. But it was done. Victoria asked to meet with him on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the findings were issued. Not in a conference room this time. She asked if he'd be willing to take a walk, which surprised him enough that he said yes before he'd thought about whether it was unusual. They walked the block around the building, which was something executives at Ashford and Vance apparently didn't do often, based on the slightly startled look from the lobby security guard when they went out together. The day was cold and overcast, the city doing its November things, and Victoria walked with her hands in the pockets of her coat and her eyes mostly forward. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you," she said after half a block. "I've been thinking about it since the morning in the conference room when I walked in and heard you explaining to Philip and Marcus what was in those notebooks." She paused. "And I've landed on the fact that there isn't a way to say it that's fully adequate. You don't need to." "I'd like to." She glanced at him. "I dismissed you in that corridor, and the dismissal was not about anything you said or didn't say. It was about how you looked and what your badge said, and the fact that I'd already decided in about 3 seconds what category you belonged to." She said it with a directness that had no excuse in it, which he respected. "I've been thinking about how many other times I've done that, in how many other situations, with how many other people." He walked a few steps before answering. "People do that. It's not an unusual thing." "No. But when you're the CEO of a firm and you do it, the categories you create have real consequences." She was quiet for a moment. "Nathan Cross's report was on my desk for 2 days before Marcus told me it was being reviewed internally, and I let it go back to him. I didn't read it. I had too much on my calendar, and I trusted that the right people were handling it." She paused. "I've thought about that a lot recently." He didn't offer absolution because it wasn't his to offer. He let the statement exist. "The role I mentioned," she said, "the board has authorized creating a senior position in structural integrity oversight, independent of the engineering team reporting directly to me. The mandate is essentially be the person who catches what gets missed." She looked at him. "I want to offer it to you formally. With full restoration of your engineering credentials in our records, your previous project history reinstated under your name, and compensation that reflects what the role actually is." The city moved around them. A cab cut off a delivery truck. Someone was smoking in a doorway. The building behind them hummed with its ordinary working life, and somewhere in its northeast section, a remediation crew was doing the slow, unglamorous work of putting right what had been ignored for too long. "I need to think about it," he said. "I know. Take whatever time you need." She wasn't pushing. That was different from how he'd imagined this conversation going, and he gave her credit for it. "I want to say one more thing." "Okay." "You said in the conference room that you left the firm the first time to raise your daughter, that you chose that." She glanced at him. "For what it's worth, I think that was the right choice. And I think the fact that you made it and built the kind of attention and patience you built into that maintenance role while you were making it, that's partly why you caught what you caught." She paused. "The engineer you were before you left might not have been walking those northeast corridors every morning at 7:50. He thought about that. He thought about the ways a life bends and what it produces by bending, the things you couldn't have made in a straight line. Mila asking about fractions, a composition notebook full of precise handwriting, the chalk mark on the wall. "No," he said. He probably wouldn't have. They finished the loop around the block. The lobby doors slid open, and the warmth of the building came out to meet them, and Victoria went back to her day, and he went back to his. Holtz. He talked to his father that Thursday, told him about the offer. His father was quiet for a long time after Elias finished explaining. Then he said, "What does Mila think?" "I haven't told her the specifics. She's 7. "Elias, she explained lateral load distribution to her teacher for 20 minutes at a science fair. Tell her." He laughed, actually laughed. "She'd probably have opinions." "She has opinions about everything. That's the point." He told Mila that evening, sat across from her at the kitchen table after dinner while she still had her homework spread out in front of her, and explained it in the way you explain things to a 7-year-old who is not actually being spoken to as a 7-year-old, directly, without excessive softening. She listened. She tilted her head to the left. "Would you still be in the building?" she asked. "Yes. Different kind of work, but the same building." "Would you have to wear a different uniform?" He hadn't thought about that. "Probably." She processed this. Would you like the work? He thought about it the way she'd asked it. Not whether he was qualified, not whether it made sense, but whether he'd like it. Yes, he said. I think I would. She nodded. A single decisive nod, the kind she used when a calculation had resolved. Then you should do it. Just like that? You've been doing the work anyway, she said, with the logic of someone who'd been following this story for weeks from inside the small kitchen of a third-floor apartment. Now they're just saying that's what you are. He sat with that for a moment, the simplicity of it, the accuracy. You're right, he said. She went back to her homework. He went to the window and looked out at the city. The buildings lit in the early dark, the particular skyline geometry he'd been reading his whole life. The way the lights told you about the structure underneath them without saying anything directly. He thought about what it meant to be seen, not the ceremonial version, not the formal letter and the restored record and the title change, though those things were real and they mattered in the way that acknowledgement matters when it has been too long absent. He meant the other kind, the kind that happened in a corridor when someone made the choice to actually look at who was standing in front of them instead of what category they'd already decided that person occupied. The kind that Nathan Cross had been denied when it mattered, and that Priya had offered when she'd said, "Ask me," instead of walking on. The kind that Mila performed casually and continuously because she hadn't been taught yet to see through the filters that made most people selective about it. You could spend years doing work that mattered, work that was accurate and patient and professionally excellent, and still be invisible to the people with the power to acknowledge it. That was true. He'd lived it. Nathan Cross had lived it harder. But the work didn't stop mattering because it wasn't seen. The anchor bracket moved, or it didn't move. The numbers were accurate, or they weren't. The building told the truth regardless of whether anyone had their ear against the wall. He'd spent 3 years learning this building the way he'd spent his whole life learning structures. By being present, by paying attention, by resisting the professional temptation to see only what the official systems were designed to show. And the building had eventually told him something that nobody else had been willing to hear. That was the thing about structures, when you thought about it, when you really thought about it. They didn't perform, they didn't manage perceptions. They just existed under their loads, telling the truth about themselves constantly, in the language of stress and movement, and the tiny increments of change that most people weren't trained to read. A building under duress didn't argue with you. It didn't negotiate. It just kept being what it was until someone paid attention or until it couldn't hold anymore. He'd been paying attention. That was all it had ever been. He accepted the position on a Monday in writing, via a formal letter, he typed himself and delivered to Philip Crane's office with a handshake that felt slightly over-formal, but right. His start date was set for the 1st of the following month, which gave him 3 weeks to complete his current maintenance assignments and transition his routes to a replacement who was being hired. He spent those 3 weeks doing his job. He did it with the same thoroughness he'd always brought to it. Not performatively, not as a statement, just because thoroughness was a habit that didn't turn off based on circumstances. The floors got cleaned, the service orders got completed, the HVAC unit near Priya's desk, which had developed a new rattle, got fixed. On his last day in the maintenance role, he did his full morning route. Every floor, every checkpoint, every corridor. He spent a few minutes on the northeast section, not out of obligation, but out of something that was partly habit and partly its own variety of respect. The remediation work was nearly complete. The injection reinforcement had been applied, the core samples had been analyzed, the monitoring system had been restored and upgraded with new sensor nodes that would have made his corridor panel readings look primitive. Sandra Ose's team had certified the preliminary stabilization 3 days ago. The final sign-off was scheduled for the end of the month. He stood in the northeast lower corridor one last time and pressed his palm flat against the interior wall. The vibration was gone. Not diminished, gone. The wall was still and solid and quiet, the way a structure feels when what's been working against it has finally been addressed. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he took his hand off the wall, picked up his cart, and finished his route. The Saturday morning after his first week in the new role, he made pancakes. This was not unusual. Pancakes were a Saturday ritual that had begun when Mila was 4 and had become one of those family fixed points. the kind of thing that wasn't significant by itself, but accumulated significance through repetition, through the fact of its persistence. Mila sat at the counter in her pajamas, watching him work the batter, her library book open on the counter beside her but not being read. She had the look of someone who was composing a question. "Papa," she said. "Yeah." "Did you fix the building?" He thought about the honest answer, the real one. "The building mostly fixed itself," he said. He poured the first round of batter into the pan and watched the edges begin to set. "I just listened to what it was trying to say." She thought about this. "But you were the one listening." "I was one of the ones listening. At the end, there were a lot of people listening." "But you were first." He flipped the first pancake. "Yeah, I was first." She seemed satisfied with this. She reached for her library book, then stopped. "Is that what engineers do? Listen to buildings?" "The good ones do," he said. "The good ones understand that a building is always telling you something. You just have to know how to hear it." She picked up the book. Then, without looking up from it, "I think I want to be an engineer." He looked at her. She was already reading, the declaration delivered with the casual certainty of someone who'd made a decision and was moving on. He turned back to the stove. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its Saturday morning things. Slower, quieter than the week, the particular Saturday light coming through the glass at an angle that made the small apartment feel larger than it was. He thought about what it cost to pay attention in a world that mostly rewarded the opposite. How you could go years being accurate and careful and right about things that mattered, and have that accuracy mean nothing to the people who ran the rooms you worked in. How the distance between what was true and what was acknowledged could stretch long enough to damage lives. And he thought about what happened when someone refused to accept that distance as permanent. Not heroically. That wasn't the right frame for it, because heroism implied that the choice was exceptional, and the choice was actually the simplest thing in the world. You noticed something. You documented it. You kept going when the obvious thing was to stop. You found one person who was willing to look, and then another, and then eventually the thing that was real could no longer be made invisible, because there were too many people who had seen it. That was all. That was the whole of it. It wasn't clean. 3 engineers had lost 20 months of their careers to it. A building had been silently compromised for nearly 2 years. A man had spent 3 years doing work that nobody connected to what he actually was. But the building was stable now, and the record was corrected, and a 7-year-old girl was reading a book about bridges at his kitchen counter and had just casually announced her future profession, and the pancakes were ready. He slid them onto her plate. She looked at them, then at him. "They're touching the syrup already," she said. "Mila." "I'm just saying." He sat down across from her with his own plate and his coffee, and the morning light came through the window, and they ate. And outside the city kept going, and the building stood where it had always stood. Steadier now, properly tended, finely seen. Some things, when they're finally made right, don't announce themselves. They just become quiet in the way things are quiet, when they're no longer under the kind of pressure they were never meant to carry. That quiet was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't always been in a position to hear it,